A special episode. We're looking at 1 Nephi chapter 4 verse 9. And I beheld his sword, and I drew it forth from the sheath thereof, and the hilt thereof was of pure gold, and the workmanship thereof was exceedingly fine, and I saw that the blade thereof was of the most precious steel. Calling this episode "And Steel It Stands." We have a special guest today who's going to talk to us a little bit more about it, but a little background before we get into that discussion. James H. Hunt was the original critic of this verse. In 1844, he listed steel as one proof that the Book of Mormon was fraudulent. Hunt, who lived in the same time and general vicinity as Joseph Smith, claimed that Alexander the Great, who lived 300 years after Nephi, employed iron weapons because steel was unknown. A coarse kind of steel, or iron carbonated, claims Hunt, came on the scene about 500 years after Laban and Nephi. Many of our school systems even still teach that steel was really invented in the Industrial Revolution, when now we have multiple, really hundreds of different archaeological finds that prove otherwise. This is one of the most interesting. It's called the Buried Jericho Sword. The Buried Jericho Sword was a small ancient Israelite fortress first excavated in the winter of 1982. It is located 3.7 miles south of Jericho, so the same vicinity, almost exactly, of where Nephi and Lehi were, on the northern side of Wadi es Suwaid. The walls still stand over 6.5 feet tall and nearly 3 feet, with 2 towers on each corner flanking the gate. Inside the fort is a courtyard with 2 dwelling structures. The fort may have also had cultic or ritual functions as a high place. It dates to the late 7th to early 6th century BC and was destroyed by fire, quite likely in either the Babylonian siege or the second siege of 588 BC. And this is what the sword looks like. It is made of steel. It is 90 centimeters long at the blade, long enough to cut the head off of a human. Now, we are not by any way, shape, or means saying that this is the sword. This is Laban's sword. We don't know if it had a gold hilt or not. Also, the sword was, according to the Book of Mormon, taken to the Promised Land and stayed with the brass plates even to this day. So, don't get it confused, but this is proof, archaeological proof, that the criticism of the Book of Mormon was indeed false. So we're going to get into a little bit more of the details. Hopefully you enjoy this. I really enjoyed the opportunity to sit down and talk with Shad, but thanks again for joining us. All right, so just I'll try to make it quick. I know it's late there. Just a little background on me. I've been kind of just for the last 4 or 5 years just really trying to do an in-depth study, not necessarily apologetically, but just kind of studying the Book of Mormon from the standpoint of, is it possible that somebody could have, made this up or done this on their own? And so instead of kind of looking at, chapter by chapter, even I've even really tried to go verse by verse and look at each verse, and got to, First Nephi chapter 4, verse 9, and decided, okay, I need to learn everything I can about swords and steel making, and everything I tried to research and look up kind of turned to you. And I thought, instead of trying to learn everything that this guy already knows, maybe we just have him on. So that's kind of why I reached out to you, and like I said, I appreciate you jumping on with me.
Not a problem. My pleasure.
Great. So maybe we'll just get started here, and if you don't mind, maybe you could introduce yourself and a little bit about your background and in swords and metal, and what got you interested in that.
Well, my name is Shad Brooks. I'm I guess a somewhat prominent online personality on YouTube, especially when it comes to swords. If you're not really into swords, medieval history, you probably don't know who I am. But I've been into this stuff my whole life. I've been a sword enthusiast, medieval enthusiast, ever since I was very, very young. And that just set me down a rabbit hole that's kind of, directed the course of my life, really. I started making YouTube videos to correct misinformation, but also to build a platform to pursue my other goals. I'm also an author, and I wanted to build an audience where I could launch my writing career from. And I was raised member of the church. I had found out to be true, and so served a mission. It was the Sydney North mission at the time. It's been combined now. Just now, it's the Sydney mission, and so I never really started YouTube as a platform to kind of promote my beliefs, although I'm very, very open about them and I don't shy away from them at all. And whenever something naturally intersected on the subjects that I was talking about, or if I had a experience to share from my, upbringing either in the church or the mission field, I'd always be very open about it. And I guess an interesting intersection happened at one point when, because I talk about so many different types of swords, is the subject of the earliest types of swords that were created, and then the materials that they were made out of, and of course steel being, a very significant progress in technology. And with that one, what I found interesting, because I'd heard about, I guess, no, I'm trying to think when was the first time I heard about the very Jericho sword. I think it must have been an article, an excerpt in the Ensign. And I think my dad might have shared it at some point. And it's really hard to find good information about this type of stuff. And I already had this point of reference to the very Jericho sword when I kind of wanted to address this subject on the video. So that set me down a bit of a rabbit hole researching that. And I made a couple of videos on the subject, and not only on the very Jericho sword, but also on the sword of Laban, because as a sword enthusiast, I've always had a pet peeve with how the sword of Laban has been depicted in multiple different medias, like art that's been made by members of the church, but also media that's been produced by the church. I don't think they've had a sword enthusiast give some thoughts or feedback on the most likely design of the sword of Laban. And I always felt that it was always too small in the artwork and in a lot of the media that's been made about it, because if the sword is going to be taking off someone's head, it needs to have a couple of properties to be able to achieve that function. And so I made a video on what I thought the more likely design of the sword of Laban was. And the strongest point of reference, of course, is the very Jericho sword, which is completely contemporary to the sword of Laban as well. And the very Jericho sword is a big sword. I took that as a bit of confirmation with my thing. Yeah. But there's a more rambly kind of background for my content and stuff.
No, that's awesome. So obviously, kind of the overarching question about this verse is, for years, so many people have taught, and we've learned in our schools, that the steel really was standardized and invented during the Industrial Revolution. And obviously, the very Jericho sword being one of the evidences that that's probably not true. But what else can you tell us about that? I mean, obviously, I think that we both agree that that's a myth or a misnomer.
Oh yeah, it's definitively not. Yeah, that's definitively not true. Yeah. I'd like to know where that myth arises, and I wonder if it's just a warping of the mass production of steel and the standardization, and to get more consistent steel results. And then they attribute that to the Industrial Revolution. The thing is, though, in terms of getting consistent steel production on a larger scale, that was happening well before the Industrial Revolution, well before. They had the blast furnace in the late medieval period in Europe. And the blast furnace is a means to fully liquefy iron and pour it into molds, and you get cast iron as a result. And for people who don't know, cast iron is a type of iron with a very high carbon content. And so how it goes, you have wrought iron. Wrought iron has a very low carbon content. And then when you hit the right amount of carbon, you get steel. And steel, I forget the exact percentages because I don't have my references, but you have a percentage amount of steel. And when you pass like 0 0.1% is when you pass steel and you get into cast iron, and that's a very high carbon content. And so they were making that in larger quantities in the late medieval period, but they also knew how to render the cast iron down into higher carbon steel. But anyway, that was the late medieval period. But that's just on a higher production and making it more consistently. They were making steel for over 1,000 years before that. In fact, the earliest records of when we say steel, as soon as you start smelting iron, it's actually, especially in coal, and if you're doing in the earliest forms was through a bloomery furnace, you have the iron in a bed of coals, and coals, that's direct carbon right there. And so it's actually impossible to not make small amounts of steel as a byproduct from the very get-go when you start smelting iron. And so when were they making steel? About the first time they were smelting iron. But then they needed to recognize it and start using it specifically. And so the earliest finds of steel that you can identify as intentionally made, like it is actually through hardened, is Cyprus at about the 11th century BC. And so steel has been made and understood and consistently for a very long time.
Yeah. So that would obviously put it before 600 BC when we would need it to be done for Laban's sword. Yeah, that was a great explanation of how one of my questions of how is steel created, and it's basically iron, right? That from iron ore that's melted down, and it has the right amount of carbon that's been added to it. Is that correct?
Correct. That's correct.
So
Right percentage, yes. Because to say that it's iron plus carbon, well, that's incorrect, because if you have too much carbon, then you have cast iron. So
right. So do you think that the early steel that we found, do you think that these people knew what they were doing and did it on purpose, or is it possible that they accidentally created steel and didn't know it?
Well, the first finds would have been accidental, but the dates that I just mentioned actually comes from a paper that I cited in one of my videos. Let's see if I can find the reference here, because what it is, I can actually share this paper with you. So maybe I'll share my screen and show this. I'll share screen. Oh, it says it's disabled. You need to allow me to do that.
Okay.
How'd we go?
Don't do anything.
Well, you've made me the host, so I'm assuming I can share my screen. Then let me. Yeah, that's done it. That's done it. All right, let me share this. Is that on screen now?
Yep.
Yeah, so this is on my video, When Was Steel Invented? And the paper that you see on screen here is a paper called The Earliest Steel from the Transjordan. And what they found here, so what you actually see there in that image is jewelry. It's a bracelet. And what they have, right, is that it's actually through hardened. And so they says the majority of these are also being composed of mild steel. And so let me get to some of the other points. Okay, so they give the date and states the earliest part of the Iron Age, which is 1200 to 1050 BC. And I need to look up if I still have this paper because it's really intriguing. But some of the takeaways from these finds right here is that it's through hardened. And so what that means is this is full steel, and you can only achieve that if it was intentional. If they didn't know what they were working with, it would be a mix, and it wouldn't be hardened either. And the other really interesting thing about this is that it's jewelry, which means that they considered it a highly prized, valuable metal, because that's what you make jewelry out of. And so I find that very intriguing, because Nephi's description of the sword of Laban, when he mentions it's steel, he doesn't call it high quality steel. He doesn't call it strong steel. He says it's made out of the most precious steel. And that is interesting, because steel in this early period was clearly a precious metal. Otherwise, you wouldn't be making jewelry out of it. And I find that very intriguing terminology, because it matches the archaeological evidence quite closely in that regard. And if someone, I think about if Joseph Smith didn't, if he made it all up, right? How on earth would he know that steel would have been considered precious? From his point of reference, steel is a pretty common enough thing. And if it's going to make steel, there's a lot of things to describe steel as, usually it would be the strongest steel or something like that. But precious is interesting.
Yeah, that is true. When that article reminded me that I in my research I noticed there's a pretty prominent mine in the Jordan area that a lot of metallurgists are trying to get iron ore from now, because of the Damascus steel, the patterns that can be created. Is the iron ore that you find and use, does that make it any easier or harder to get to steel? Would they have used certain would they have had certain mines where they felt like, this is an easier way to make steel? Is the iron from this mine because we're closer to the right carbon content, or does the iron that you find not matter?
Well, it's a little complex. So, for instance, the mine that you're referencing, that they speculate it was one of the sources to make Damascus steel, is because it has trace amounts of vanadium in it.
Yeah.
And they believe vanadium is one of the trace things that forms these specific types of carbides in the structure throughout the smelts, which then gives the pattern. But I don't think it's the only source for Damascus. But back to your question specifically, usually in terms of making steel, it doesn't necessarily matter where it comes from in terms of achieving the quality of steel. What does matter is the level of purity of the ore itself. And so there are certain sources of iron ore that you get in a much purer form, which means you don't have to deal with as many of the problems. Like phosphorus and silicon can be issues in iron ore, general slag, which are just non-metallic inclusions. And so a good source of iron ore is a source that is mostly pure iron. And I honestly don't know how pure the sources of iron ore were in the region, because regardless of the purity, if you're going to be making steel out of it, that's more about the smelting technology and process versus the input. Now, some of those trace elements in the iron ore can be beneficial in the steel, and usually that's people don't know about it, like the vanadium. Like they didn't know what vanadium was in the iron ore that helped make Damascus. They were just, it made this iron, ended up making this really interesting byproduct. But to actually go through the process to make this iron ore into steel, if you put any other iron ore in that same process, you would still achieve steel. And so it's not necessarily easier to make steel, but you can get interesting results based on the quality of iron that you put into the process.
Gotcha. That makes sense. All right, kind of shifting gears. The gold hilt of Laban's sword, is that uncommon, or is that out of place? Is that
No, not at all. There are gold hilted daggers and swords from Babylon and all throughout the region. There are surviving examples of gold hilted swords and daggers that they're not uncommon. In fact, you almost do a basic Google search and you will find surviving period examples that predate the sword of Laban as well, by the way.
And most of those examples would be probably gold hilt with an iron sword, right? Or am I wrong? Is that what we see mostly?
Yeah. So it's interesting, the classification of iron in the record, because like I said, if you're smelting this thing in a bed of coals, you're going to have trace amounts of steel in it anyway. And so the in archaeology, as a result, they tend to even refer to intentionally made steel artifacts as iron artifacts anyway. And I'll share my screen again because I got a really interesting example, because when I made my video on the very Jericho sword and subsequently the sword of Laban, someone had the gall to accuse me of purposely lying to misrepresent things, and that upset me. And so this is an interesting reference right here. So this comes from this study here, which is Iron in Anatolia and the Nature of the Hittite Iron Industry. So in this article, I'll just read this out. It says, more striking is the analysis of a small middle Bronze Age blade from Pella. Now, middle Bronze Age, this actually means that this should actually predate the previous example of the jewelry, because we're in the Bronze Age now. So that's like before 1000 BC. Iron Age blade from Pella, Jordan, perhaps coming from miniature notch chisel axe. Made of carburized iron, i.e. steel, it was quickly cooled as indicated by the microstructure, probably by quenching into water, an act which imparts even greater strength to the carburized iron. And on the following page, the terminology that they use is really interesting. And I just got an ad on, well, this is on my own video, so we'll skip that. All right. So where is the reference there? Here it is. Okay. So from Sardis is a tool of the late 11th century BC, which was made of laminating two blocks of iron, one carburized and one not. The use of carburized iron, steel, and so they're constantly referring to these artifacts by iron. It's use of carburized iron or the steel to strengthen edges shows that smiths realized the superiority of the carburized product, and then they conserve energy by carburizing they didn't carburize the entire thing. And so where is this? Okay, here's another example of the same thing. It's good evidence regular use of steel by the 10th century than the latest, with early occurrence of carburized bracelets from burial caves in the Bakwa Valley of Jordan. And so, by the way, if you note the regions where all these steel artifacts are being found, they're all this, Middle Eastern regions very close to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So this one, all right. So look at this. The most spectacular find is an iron pick from the 12th to 11th century, and so they refer to it as an iron pick. And they found in Mount Rad, Northern Galilee, almost perfectly preserved. The pick had been carburized, quenched, and mildly, and then it follows through to the next page, and mildly tempered all the treatments known in effective steel production until the 19th century. And so they're referring to a steel artifact, calling it iron as well. And so it could get confusing then when people want to look up, points of evidence about this stuff, is that archaeologists still refer to steel artifacts as iron artifacts.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I ran across that too. Even reading about the very Jericho sword. I mean, a lot of the articles called it an iron sword, and then there's
even in there's a museum website that refers iron sword, and when there is an excerpt from the original article, that was the article that was studied on this, and they state black and white, it is steel. Well, and it can also be confusing, the very Jericho sword in particular, because it's actually it's a composite construction where the handle and the central ridge is iron, but the blade is steel. And again, this is a very interesting thing, because it meant that they knew specifically the difference between steel and iron and preserved the stronger steel for the blade, the actual business, a portion of the sword, where the central ridge and handle were iron. And so it really shows their technical knowledge in that regard. But then it's not fully steel, it's iron and steel. And so I think they just because steel is technically iron, like it's not incorrect to call steel iron. It's mostly iron, in fact. It only has a small percentage of carbon, so they just refer to it as it's an iron artifact.
Yeah, it's so interesting. One of the rabbit holes that I started down as I was starting to do my research is the connection between swords and kings. Is there what, I guess, what, from your understanding, what is the connection, kind of the romanticized connection between, in history, between a king and his sword, and passing it down, I guess, generation to generation, or in a leadership role, and what does that have to do with the sword?
It honestly varies between cultures. Swords in the earlier period were more expensive to make, and as a result were considered more valuable and prestigious. And so certainly amongst early Scandinavia during the migration period, so Vikings, but not everyone in that area were Vikings. They were, Scandinavians. And Viking was just an occupation that some did. And so in that period, swords were more prized, and so they'd be buried with their swords, but of course buried with axes as well. But swords in particular were considered more prestigious, harder to make. And when I say more materials, it does vary on the size of axe versus the size of sword, but you can get away with a very, very functional axe that is mostly iron. And even if you wanted to harden the actual cutting portion, you can just add steel to the very edge. But for a sword, it's a lot harder, and swords are more fragile than axes. And so to make a stronger functional sword, again, requires a lot of technical know-how to do that. And so we see examples, and this is, medieval, pre-medieval stuff, of certain items being seen to having value. It can vary. It doesn't always have to be a sword, and there was certainly still what didn't mean that every single sword was considered really valuable and you would consider it an heirloom, because you look at all the different gladiators during the Roman period and stuff. Not all of them were prized, but then there were really fancy ones, and so it really depends on the quality of the make, the intention behind its purpose, and it's not just swords that were considered valuable kind of items that portrayed a certain level of prestige about them. We see multiple items in many different cultures. But swords are an interesting one. In terms of the most romanticized weapons, swords are up there amongst the very top. And that is a really intriguing thing to consider why. And that's something I've pondered on for a very long time. And there are multiple answers. And one of the answers, interestingly enough, is the role that it fills. Swords are uniquely convenient amongst weapons of this period to wear. An axe is a bit harder to wear. It's a bit more awkward to keep safe and things. And a sword, it's not necessarily better than a spear, but it's a lot easier to take with you. And it can do other things that the spear can't. And so the sword functioned as the weapon, as someone's primary sidearm, essentially. It was a weapon for self-defense, even though it was definitely a battlefield weapon, especially in the early periods. But because it was kind of the primary companion weapon that people usually use throughout many points in history, considering the weapon that, what would we idolize as an honored gift? Well, usually it would be the weapon that people carry with them and use more often and is more versatile and stuff like that. And so a sword has usually been the one that has become more prestigious in terms of symbology and gifting and other things. Other weapons were done as well, but swords by far more than most other weapons.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously in the Book of Mormon we read about really the leader of the Nephite nation always had the sword of Laban, and it was kind of passed down to the leaders of that civilization, and that's kind of how they identified either the rightful heir to the throne or who exactly was in charge. Is there any other examples in history of a sword being used in that way that you know of, or is
like passed down?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's Joyous, the sword of, I think it was Charlemagne. Let me actually double check that. You just bear with me, because this one I do want to check, because this is a good point. Because by the way, Joyous, gold hilt as well.
Oh, awesome.
Yep, there it is. Let me get an image of this up here for you, because this is a very good example. So interestingly enough, this took me to a video game website. Let me get all right, here we go. I'll share my screen on this one. So share screen. There we are. So you can see that. Is that on your screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is Joyous, Charlemagne's sword. And what's really interesting about it, so it's surviving today. So it's been passed down for a very long time. And interestingly enough, solid gold hilt. So solid gold hilts for swords, not uncommon. What's really interesting about Joyous is that I can basically guarantee this is not what this sword looked like in Charlemagne's time when it was first made. First of all, like, it has a more pronounced crossguard. In Charlemagne's time, swords did not have cruciform wider crossguards. I haven't seen any period examples, surviving examples, or examples in art of a crossguard of Charlemagne's time. And you can even see just by close examination that it's been like when I say remade, I suspect certain things broke and then they remade it and added bits here and there. The pommel might actually be original, because that is of the style of the period. But even the blade, there's no guarantee that the blade is original on Joyous here. So anyway, like, case in point, perfect point of reference for absolutely swords were passed down as kind of heirlooms. Sorry, that was shared the whole time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you saw those. It's cool. And not only that, it gives us an interesting point of reference of what might have happened to the sword of Laban. We know it was being used in battle multiple times. Swords get damaged in battle. And so I highly suspect that the sword of Laban got damaged and needed to be repaired, and maybe even had some more serious damages and might have needed to be rehilted perhaps at certain times. And we don't know the extent of the damages, but at least some mild ones. There'd have to be some mild ones, but it could be that there could be even parts by the time of the end of the Nephite period and when it was buried, that there were fully replaced parts on the sword of Laban versus its state when Nephi, inherited it. Let's call it that. Yeah.
So yeah, that was actually, one of my other thoughts and questions, I guess, is could it possibly that this sword, evolved and was remade and reconstructed to the point where, where when Joseph Smith saw the actual sword of Laban, he may not have been seeing all the same parts that Nephi saw when he first took it from Laban.
Yeah, it is possible, because we weren't given I've never found a description of the sword of Laban from Joseph Smith's perspective. Mm-hmm. And so it could have been that the hilt survived completely. It's a gold hilt, it's valuable. They don't want to lose it. And so if it was got damages, they did either repair it and try and keep it in its original state, or it could be that it might have an entirely new hilt. They had to rehilt the entire thing. A blade could have broken. They had to try and reforge it together. There are some interesting points of references to indicate that the Nephites might have actually lost the technology to work with steel. And I forget the exact one, but I was reading through the Book of Mormon, but references to making steel, you do not see. They kind of cease from, I haven't double checked this one. It's been a while, so I'm going off memory. But from memory, they ceased. And I forget at which point. It was either after Zarahemla or during. But in terms of people's claims that there is a lack of steel items amongst Native American, descendants and stuff, that actually might very well be one of the explanations for that the Nephites forgot how to work with steel. And steel is a very difficult thing to preserve anyway because of rust. In fact, we have some really pristine surviving bronze swords that are in surprisingly good condition because the metal, lasts a lot longer and doesn't weather and deteriorate to the level that steel does. And so a lot of the surviving steel swords of just the medieval period and are not good condition, and trying to find steel artifacts earlier, especially to the periods when we're looking at the Nephites, is very we have steel artifacts we've found, but they're very few and far between and nowhere near representative to the scale or level that they would have had. And that's in where it was really, really common. And so if you look at the Nephites amongst the Americas, there's a good chance that they've actually forgot the technology to work with steel from the get-go, which means it wouldn't have been prominent or spread amongst the Nephite people very broadly at all. And then depending on where the Nephites were actually located and how large of a population there were, and I'm of the opinion that I think the Nephites were smaller in population and location than I guess other people have speculated. It actually makes it would be really hard to find any surviving steel artifacts from the Nephites, especially if they forgot how to even make it, which it seems like the Book of Mormon indicates.
Yeah, that is interesting. So kind of going back to that point of kind of swords being remade and reconditioned and repaired and through time, do we have any indications of how old, or going back the other way in history, how far back it could be that's the sword of Laban actually originated? Is it possible that it goes back further than Laban, that he inherited it from somebody? And
maybe, I mean, we have steel artifacts that predate that by several hundred years. There's daggers, there's the jewelry. The very Jericho sword is the greatest point of reference and evidence for it, because it's so contemporary with it. It dates to 600 BC, and it's a steel sword found in Jericho. And so as to how long it might have predated, I don't know. That's hard to speculate, but it could have been made earlier, of course, by even 100 years, perhaps, because we know steel was around in that region before that period, even. So it might have, yeah.
One of the theories that I don't know if there's any credence to it or not, but going back to kind of the lost pages, there was an interview done with a man named Fayette Latham, and he with Joseph Smith Sr. And one of the things he alluded to from these lost pages is that this sword had been passed down with the record previous to Laban. So the record of Joseph and the brass plates, that sort of it being passed down, maybe even back to Joseph from Abraham.
In Egypt?
Yeah, in Egypt. So that could be 1500 BC, 1600 BC. But one of the things that I thought about as you were, discussing this is maybe that was steel and maybe not, but it could have eventually become steel, right? They could have replaced the blade by the time of Laban with the steel.
That's actually true. Yes. Re-hilting swords, especially damaged ones, is a common enough thing, especially if you had valuable parts. If you had like a gold hilt and the blade broke, you don't want it to go to waste, and so putting a new blade onto it is a very reasonable conclusion that could have happened multiple times actually. So yeah, absolutely, that is definitely a possibility.
Another thing that jumps out to me when I read the Book of Mormon is how often Nephi talks about or is working with metal. From your reading, I mean, do you think that the Nephi had the expertise or the interest or the background to understand? I mean, when he saw the sword of Laban, he immediately identified it, right, as precious steel. He had to build the tools out of ore when he was building the ship. He recreated the sword once he got to the promised land. In your experiences, does this seem like Nephi had a history with metals and understood this, or is this something that would have been widespread understanding or common knowledge at the time?
I don't think it would be common knowledge, but if you were a craftsman or a trader or some type of stuff, it's much more likely you would have that knowledge. And it does seem like, I mean, we know that Lehi and his family were wealthy, and so they had many riches to be able to offer Laban to get the plates. And so then how do you become wealthy? Well, trading and crafting, being a craftsman, are top of the list in terms of the region and period. And so it is a safe kind of speculation to wonder that Lehi very well might have been a type of either craftsman or trader, and he could have worked directly in regards to steel, and Nephi could have been raised literally in that kind of environment, learning the craft, because he clearly knew how to make stuff. Like he was definitely a talented craftsman to be able to just, I'll make make steel tools out of ore, and I'll make a boat. And he knew how to work with timber as well. And so it's if he clearly had those skills and abilities, therefore he must have learnt them growing up, which seems a good indication that it's associated with their family trade somehow.
Yeah. The last kind of stone I wanted to turn over is the idea of, King Arthur's sword, these magic swords in history. It seems like we talked about before, that this weapon has been romanticized throughout history. And we talk about, these magic weapons of these magic swords. Do you think that has any relation to the steel production of swords? Do you think that, that these seemed magic because they go up against bronze swords or iron swords that just are debilitating to them? Is that
oh yeah, I think it's a very high likelihood. I've even made a video speculating that very thing on I forget the name of the video, but it's just like where the magic swords of the past might have originated from, because steel is a lot stronger than iron, a lot stronger than bronze, and its properties and performance would have really stood out. And especially like I've had I've had swords clash in tests and other experimentations and fun and stuff, and to see the difference in material strength and the effects, and sometimes like one sword, there's not even a mark on it, and it gives a big gouge and dint in the other sword. And if steel were, you weren't too familiar with it, you hadn't seen it before, it would seem like this sword has some type of magical strength to it, because it is not getting damaged when these other swords are taking some serious, beatings. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very interesting thing to consider.
Yeah. All these, I mean, there were so many rabbit holes that I started down when I started diving into this verse. But a lot of them just led my research just led to you. So I really appreciate you jumping on and answering a bunch of these questions I had. There's a bunch of things that I had questions about that I learned today from you. So I appreciate that. Is there a place that, my viewers can go to learn more from your channel?
Oh, I mean, yeah, Shadiversity is my YouTube channel. I'll share one last thing, because this one was pretty cool. I didn't have this when I made my original video. And so, like I said, the closest point of reference for the sword of Laban is the Vera Jericho sword, which is a steel sword that they found in Jericho. And it has this, quote from the original paper that studied it, saying that it was steel. But all I could find was quotes, and it was really, really hard to find the original source for where this came from to actually confirm it. Since making my videos, I actually reached out to the museum in Jordan, and they responded, and they sent me the original article. And this is not available anywhere online, but they were able to send it to me directly. And I'll just share it with you because it's pretty awesome. Yeah, it's pretty cool. And so there we go. I'll share this here. So this here is the Israel Museum Journal, and this is where all the research is done. And one of the coolest things about it, because this image here, I have not been able to find this image anywhere online, and it is a more detailed kind of drawing of the Vera Jericho sword, and a speculation of what they think it perhaps looked like in its original state. And I would actually want to update my design based on this, though I think there is one thing that there might be an inaccuracy here, and it's the tip of the blade. I think they are assuming that the blades merged in with the central ridge here, based on the how the original one has deteriorated up near the tip, when in terms of functional sword design, as well as swords contemporary of the period, like Bronze Age swords and other things like that, these prominent central ridges were very prominent, but the blades usually always come up to the tip. And so I think what's actually happened is that there was erosion here, and this steel has just eroded away, and then they're kind of just assuming that therefore the blades then ended early, when I actually think the blade would have gone right up to the tip, because that's the point of references that we have with all the other swords of the period. But anyway, this is awesome stuff.
Yeah.
And it has all the information, and here is the quote right here. It says, radiographic X-ray examination and photography of the sword indicate that the hilt, ridge, and the blade were prepared separately and then forged together by hammering. Metallurgic analysis of a sample taken from the blade proves that it was made of mild steel and that the iron was deliberately hardened into steel, attesting to the technical knowledge of the blacksmiths. And so that's it right there. That Israelites around 600 BC not only had steel, but they knew what it was, and they're so intriguing that they made it out of different periods. And look, we even have a cross section here that shows the different kind of sections of the sword that was put together.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really, really cool stuff. And so if the sword of Laban was to be like any sword at all, it would be like this one here.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Pretty darn cool.
All right, Shad. Well, man, I appreciate you sharing that with us, and appreciate you coming on and jumping on late in Australia. I know I screwed up the time zone once, and
no, that's fine.
Glad we could make this work. So I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, thanks, Shad. It's nice to meet you.
No worries. I'll catch you.